Hannah, I was listening to your talk. I was thinking you were going to conclude in a different direction. I thought, oh, this is going to lead up to the water rising from climate change, and how the beach is fetishized in a way as the water is coming up. We don't really talk about, say, heat or fire or the other damaging part of climate change, but the beach disappearing is sort of the image along with the polar bear. Um, Yet you ended your talk in a much more inspiring way, which I'm grateful for. What about the climate beach?
I know. It's the frame. I mean, it's the kind of shadow over the beach. I mean, the beach as a site that is so precarious and is continuously being artificially nourished and is constantly eroding and is going to be an increasingly impossible space of leisure and recreation. I think I'm drawn to the beach for the same reason that I'm drawn to the aesthetic as a category, and it's problematic in similar ways. And it's supposed to be a commons that's not really, right? But there's still some hope. One still holds out some hope of some kind of alternative mode of relationality, some idea of some sort of a refuge. So I think, to the extent that writing is a self-sustaining project in dark times, I think I end with the Bjork in order to sustain myself. But yeah, I mean, in a longer version of this, I need to think more about the beach as a site both of utopia but also always dystopia. And for example, Aimé Césaire's beach was a horrible place, right? It's a space that where he's trying to ruin it for colonial commodification. It's a space where la mer déverse ses immondices. So there are a lot of other directions that this material goes in. I just happen to be drawn toward a certain type of aesthetic material.
Thank you. Thank you both for your talks and bringing us back to a Bjork song that I haven't listened to in a long time. So I actually have a question for each of you. I'll make it short. So Emmanuel, I was wondering about how humans interact with this flower architectural design and the kinds of alternate sexualities that are possible, because as I was listening to you, it reminded me of Michel Tournier, since we've spoken of him this morning, Vendredi ou les lames du Pacifique. And you have these tentatives, right? These attempts on Robinson's part of making love to a tree, right? But his penis is bitten by a spider. He realizes that the la voie végétale, at least kind of the tree way, is wrong. And then later in the novel, you have him making love to the ground and reproducing mandrakes as children. So I was wondering about how you are thinking about the kinds of alternate sexualities, which I'm kind of thinking about queer ecologies here as well. And then my question for Hannah, since, again, this morning we were talking about the heavens crashing to the earth and this kind of alienocene, what struck me in the list, Darius's sex list, was the debout d'ovni, ayant raté leur coup. And I was wondering what you do with that, the ovni in there, and the kind of granular view that she's offering us that counters the kind of grandiose view from the Anthropocene. So those are my two questions.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I would say that perhaps you don't need to make sex with plants or the ground in order to become queer. In the sense that what plants teach is the fact that even if you're breathing, in the case of plants, it's clear. I mean, in order to have a sexual union with another individual of the same species, they need insects, wind, water. They need the intervention of other individuals, other beings coming from different ontological regions. So in a way, sex is for them always sort of cosmic or justic element. But perhaps it's always the case even for us. I mean, I don't want it to specify what I mean, but in order to have this kind of experience, we need wine, we need also, I mean, what they teach us is the fact that we perhaps we have restricted, or we have considered sex as something which implies only two human beings, whereby actually every act, a sexual act, there are a lot of other beings which are implied. And in this sense, sex is always queer. It is always ecological. It's always an drastic involvement of different elements and different species of different. I mean, you have to eat something and so on. So the implication is not the same, but what is interesting to me, in the example of plant sex or plant sexuality, is exactly this cosmic opening of the act, and then this queerness, which is, and in this sense, I mean, of course, there is a lot of also medical texts which are speaking about, to make sex with the ground, or, but even if we are the squarest person of the world, you are making something very queer. I mean, we've been doing, but not just sex. What I want to show is that even breathing is, in a way, a kind of, I mean, when you're breathing, you are eating literally, it's metaphor, but you are eating the shit of plant shit. So it's sort of very, very strange. And not only you are eating shit, but you are transforming this very horrible gesture in the gesture that gives you life, which is strange and interesting.
Hard to follow that, but so les bouts d'ovnis, maybe Frédéric could help me with that. I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated by the kinds of language that this space enables, and the idea of the list with its granularity. So I have to come back to this question. I mean, since I offered that citation because I find it interesting and I want to think more with it. As for the sandiness, I think granularity is maybe kind of an underthought aesthetic category or sensory category. There's an interesting essay by Vanessa Agar-Jones, an anthropologist at Columbia, all about the black sands beaches of Martinique and about the beach as a queer site. And she talks about the way there's been so much written about water, but sand, like it gets in your cracks. She says there's something about sand in the way that it sticks to you that is a really interesting substance. So I'm sort of thinking with this, that granularity seems so not Proustian to me. Thank you.
It's about Baalbek again. Baalbek 1, because there are two Baalbeks actually. It's Baalbek 1. I think something could be added to what you said, which is the weather. Because after all, Marcel had come to Baalbek thinking he would be at the end of the world in a kind of semi-mythological place, foggy, etc. And every day it's sunshine. And the last sentence of the episode sums up actually this fil rouge of the episode.
Oh, sorry. What the last sentence of the episode? What
says exactly that. That every morning when he woke up, there was the sun behind the curtain, and it's a beautiful sentence that ends the.
Oh, the light on the scene. Yes, no, it's one of my beautiful. No, thank you. You're right. Yeah, so he's expecting a certain kind of fantasy of storms against a cliff. And instead gets the kind of utopic scene that we've now come to associate so much with the beach. And in I think a 2010 book, Christophe Granger writes about the way that the invention of the beach, or the cultural sort of formation of the beach at this time, is really about a new conception of the season itself, right? A kind of invention of the summer as spectacle, and not as a kind of time for of planting or of récolte. So this idea of a kind of aestheticization of summer itself, which is a disappointment for the narrator, is interesting. I think there's more to say about Proustian weather. We can discuss
Hi, yes, I have a question about sort of how we should conceive of species, taking into account the very idea that interest-specific relations can always be mediated by other species or other kinds of beings. Does this ultimately dissolve the very idea of a space of natural types in some sense, or a classificatory space of determinate species and genuses? So I guess what's kind of the underlying ontology of this ecological vision, and what then do we make of sort of Western sciences architectures of classification?
Thank you for the question. I never thought about the implication for taxonomy of this idea, and I have to think about it. I do not have a prepared answer, but I would say that no, it does not necessarily imply the fact that you have um, to renounce of this kind of classification, even if you are not, even if we don't decide if they are natural categories or they are artificial and so on. The main idea was actually another one. It was that even if you are thinking about the fact that every species is ontologically different from all the other one, uh, what I try to show is the fact that actually just because of eating, the existence of every single individual of every single species depends on other species, and the immediate consequence of that is the fact that every form of political organization of a number of individuals belonging to one species is also or implies also a project on the existence of that other species or of those other species which represent actually the food of the first one. So uh, in this sense, I do not think that this kind of ideas destroy taxonomy in the same sense that in a way agriculture is not destroying the difference, the ontological difference between me and corn or me and maize or me and wheat and so on. But it stresses the fact that every word start every piece of landscape started with a starts with association of multiple species actually, and an association which is not the other idea, which is not the natural one. I mean, there is no such a thing like a sort of a natural relationship, a natural link between I don't know bees and flowers or trees and soil. We are actually accustomed to think about this kind of relationships in a very, very theological form. I mean, the history of ecology shows that ecology is actually one of the remnants of our theological thinking. It would be too long to explain that, but one of those remnants is the fact that we are not able to think, for instance, about the relationship between a tree and the soil. It occupies as a political one, as a technical one, and we are supposed or we are accustomed to think about that as something which rises from nature. So this is I don't know if I gave an answer to your question, kind of.
I have a question for Emanuele. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is I'm very interested in this idea of a primary association between species as being the design for building communities. And you talk about it as a political relationship, which I'm very sympathetic to, but how can we think the risk or I don't know, the absence of reciprocity sometimes among those relationships. And I'm thinking especially in the relationship, for example, between the human and the crops that we are growing, and how to start this dialogue. I would say that will kind of foster the political agencement, I want to say. And my second question is much more vague. You talked about space as being never natural or already there. I was wondering if you make a difference between space and matter as two different ontological categories, or they're the same.
So thank you so much for the two questions. The first one is a huge one, and perhaps, but this will answer to the question better than me tomorrow. But I would say that, and again, I didn't, or I thought about that, but I do not have a proper answer. But I would say politics does not coincide with democracy. There is a lot of political form where there are no kind of reciprocal relationship. So in this sense, perhaps there is no reciprocal relationship, but it does not mean that there is no political relationship. First of all, the second point to your question would be that perhaps you can see this kind of attempt to transform agriculture from the Green Revolution model to the agroecological model as an attempt to involve this kind of reciprocal relationship, and also to involve multi-specific relationship even among vegetal species, in the sense that in agroecological models you're not supposed to plant just one species, yet always you must have many species in a field. So, but the main point I would say is that power exists, and oppression is also a political fact. So it is a fact that in nature there are sometimes there are not always reciprocity. But in the case of bees or insects and flowers, perhaps in this case there is a form of reciprocity. But your question was about human, the human or.
Well, I mean, because there's also, I don't remember where I was reading that, but this idea that, for example, the same way that these beings, they're might think that like bees are taking advantage of, thinking that they're taking advantage of plants, whereas actually plants also take advantage of them to spread. The same idea that maybe the potatoes is taking advantage of the human in order to reproduce through agriculture, and this kind of it sounds anthropomorphic, and so that's this kind of what I was reading that kind of led me to also
Michael Pollan, probably.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Just thinking of that. So yes, and also I mean I guess it's also related to the work of Baptiste Morisot, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, but how as soon as we start and taking into account the political relationships that we are already in with other species and with what we call the non-human, how then can we create a space to reinvent them in a dialogue without it seems that there's a verticality which I'm not sure how to escape. I'm not sure, maybe it's not very, it's vague, I'm sorry.
No, it's very clear. The question is that, first of all, my problem is not to change, to invent new forms of politics. My problem was just to determine or to name what kind of relationship exists between species, and to undermine the fact that, I just want to say it's a stupid idea, the idea that all the human beings can exert agriculture and husbandry. this kind of relationship exists everywhere in nature. This was the main idea. And of course, perhaps this kind of relationship implies a lot of power and so on, and verticality. But it was not my problem to democratize nature or the world. Not at this moment. Perhaps and concerning the point about who is exploiting whom. Yeah, there is a lot of. I mean, also in botanics, there is a lot of people saying, yeah, it's not. You cannot say that man is exploiting wet because through man, through the human species, wet became the most important vegetal species in the world, and it was not supposed to become that actually before agriculture. So I would say that the idea of exploitation or utility, the ideal of utility, is also one of the remnant of the theological thinking in biology, actually. So it's not interesting to decide where is the profit and for whom, because it's not a good question. And just two words about space and matter. No, I would say that there is no difference actually. Yeah, but it's a very common. I mean, it's the modern idea that matter is res extensa, and conversely. So in this part, I mean, I'm not saying that in a metaphysical way, in the sense that I always think of space as a matter. But in this paper and what I said, I thought about space as matter, and conversely as a matter, as a kind of spatialization of life. So,
can I just jump onto that quickly? And I wanted to ask you. I was really invigorated by what you had to say about flowers, and it made me think also about poetry and how this is all related. But when you're talking about flowers, their active intelligence is the capacity to delegate, offering a space of arrival, of rest, and so on. I mean, is it possible to think about this without gendering it? Because it sounds without thinking about gender, or without thinking about, because it sounds so much like a form of kind of feminine agency, or this inverted husbandry. It's difficult to not hear that in the flower, which is the kind of the feminized object par excellence.
But the problem is the mass flowers have two genders in the same body, so it's that actually the idea that there's a lot of mechanism that actually it's impossible for mass flowers. It's impossible to self-pollinate. I mean, the involvement of insects, water, or air is supposed to replace the possibility of that the two gender elements in the same flowers can pollinate the other. So in this sense, it would be interesting to genderize that. But then in order to actually to break or to destroy all this kind of human, or to think about what does it mean to be hermaphrodite or something like that. It is perhaps the politics of hermaphrodite, something like that. Politics of I don't know, but I didn't thought about that because of the fact that I mean because of the fact that all mass flowers have both genders on the body, so it is as if we did have two sexual organs. Which is also which is also interesting. But how can in the case that I would have two sexual organs, what are you doing? To have sex.
I have a question for Hannah, and I was wondering the corpus that you're constructing and exploring the idea of the modernist beach. Are there any beaches that are not on the ocean? And I noticed in the definition that you gave at the beginning about beaches, it mentioned lakes and rivers. And thinking backwards, thinking about like the Ur text of French Romanticism being Lamartine's Le Lac, and how much time the poet spends next to the lake on the beach, thinking about it. But also thinking maybe more in contemporary terms about the phenomenon
that we see in Brooklyn and Paris of constructing these artificial beaches next to city rivers in this way,
Yeah.
Paris Plage, and
Yeah.
the same thing happens in Dumbo, of bringing sand to spaces that
Yeah.
are next to rivers in order to make one think that you are at the beach. So are there texts that you're exploring that look at, say, lakes and rivers as beach phenomena, or is there something particular about the oceanic?
Yeah, no, thank you, and thanks for the invocation of Paris Plage and Dumbo, which I guess I should visit. I haven't been there. So at this point, the hardest thing about this project is just to kind of delineate it. Obviously, it's just so right now I have it sort of structured by the authors, the texts that are most problematic to me, and so it's sort of organized around Proust and Woolf, and especially Rachel Carson and Darius Sec, with possible other kind of offshoots. So right now it's very much a kind of Atlantic project, actually, and where the main contrast would be between the tidal pool and the sand beach. But I would definitely, if you have suggestions of other texts that I should be looking at.
I can't answer to your question and to your question, actually. No, the question about taxonomy, perhaps you were right, actually. I was thinking because actually taxonomy through cladistic defines species only through genealogy. That is only through multi-specific relationship, but involved in the generation of a species. Perhaps a new kind of taxonomy should try to define species also to the relationship with other species which have nothing to do with genealogy. With the fact that I don't know, I'm eating a lot of chicken, so human species and chicken species are related also in a taxonomic way. Perhaps we should free taxonomy from genealogy, or we should, in general, free biology from genealogy, actually, and think that this is not the most important relationship between species. The most important relationship between species or among species are of another kind than the one of genealogy. And the question about space, actually, I understood why I should say, yeah, they are the same, because a space, at least in the paper, space was considered as a form of plastical, manipulable element. So as matter, as something which has to be designed all the time. It's not something which is out there. And so in this sense, yeah, it is matter in the sense that matter is the object of manipulation, of custom manipulation. So perhaps this is the reason why you are asking me to this kind of question, and why I immediately answer to you, yeah, they are the same, yeah. Sorry.
I would like to have a follow-up question to your question with Emmanuel on the issue of anthropomorphism. So in your talk, you used a lot of terms that kind of defines human agency, right? City, agriculture, garden, design, architecture, and arguably those are very strong words signifying human agency. And the human condition, right? And when you use those words to describe natural environment, you risk, or you could, I'm sort of asking about what does that mean in terms of projecting the human world onto the natural world. And we are kind of doomed to that, aren't we? We're human beings, and we cannot see the natural world any different than human beings can. We're doomed to that. So I'm sort of wondering how do you address the issue of anthropomorphism, especially when you use so loaded terminology in describing natural world. And you are, of course, not the only one. The biologists do it constantly. The word ecology is from the economy of nature.
Yeah.
In a descriptive world of microbiology, we talk about cell colonies, and colony is a very political term. So this is not a problem with your talk. It's a general problem, and I would like to hear how you struggle with it.
No, thank you so much, because it is a very, very important question in the sense that, as you said, actually biology is full of anthropomorphical projections. I think, as you said, economy of nature, but also ecology. Ecology, the idea that nature is a combination of homes or houses, or the distinction, even the distinction, for instance, of invasive plants comes from the projection of the common law of the 19th century to the categories of common law of the 19th century to natural beings. So actually, we are, as you said, we are doomed to do that. I would say that the problem, first of all, the problem is not that we are projecting some anthropomorphical categories, it's the fact that we are projecting some of them and some not. This is the main problem for me, to me. Okay, why we are speaking about without any problem about colonies and not about husbandry, agriculture, I mean, or something like that. But perhaps the most important point is the fact that to me the problem is not projections. The problem is that we are doing the projection only halfway. Actually, when you're saying, for instance, there is a sort of agriculture in between bees and flower, we are not just anthropomorphizing bees and flowers. We are also beifying and flowerizing human. And actually, we are just making the first step and never the second step. Because every kind of projection is a sort of transfer in the two senses of the relationship of the properties from the one to the other, that we are not able to take also the consequences of this projection. In this sense, it is a problem. If we are saying, bees are making agriculture out of flowers, it is a problem only if we are not assuming the consequence that we are making the same as bees actually. So agriculture becomes no more something human. It is clear. So it is not, in this sense, the projection is a very, very important, interesting activity, because you are destroying the humanity or the exclusivity, the human exclusivity of this kind of activities. If you're saying everybody is doing agriculture, agriculture has nothing human at all. As in the same sense that, for instance, ecology, since its foundation, since Linné, used to think that the space represents for a lot of species kind of home, oikos. And this is, in this sense, for us to speak about home, about human, about biological entities, is no more anthropomorphical projection, because we are, in this case, we assume the consequence. Home is not something which is just linked to human species. But at that time, at the time from Linné, I mean, to speak about homes of oikia or cause about nature, it was not just an anthropological projection, it was also a theological one, because the idea that that is oikos and so on. So.
Yeah, I just would like to follow up on that, because it's also related to my initial question, is that I think the question of the anthropomorphism is, like, we're thinking in terms of correspondences and comparisons, which, like, Frédéric talked this morning about. And I think the real question is the question not of the comparison, but of the translation, like being able to translate into our own terms the terms that of other cultures, including specific cultures, in such a way that it transforms ours. And I think that that's like the using terms like colonies or that are too anthropomorphized is not as useful as using terms coming from biology to describe human organizations or things like that. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but
yeah, but I would say that the problem of anthropomorphism is only a problem for people who are fetishizing, who are fetishists of species. Actually, we never understood, or we never understood. It's too strong. I mean, but the meaning of the theory of Darwin's theory about evolution is that actually every species is a metamorphosis of another one, a previous one. So there is no such a thing as a pure species. Human is a zoo, actually. The human species is something which is a sort of bricolage of bacterial forms of life, apes, fishes, and so on. So when we are speaking about humanity, we are not speaking about something which is totally not linked with the rest. This is a sort of carnivalesque mixture of different species. So in this sense, to speak about the fact that we share a lot of things with other species is totally normal, because I don't know, there is a lot of our genetic code that comes from bacteria, another part from fishes, and we are just a chimera of different other species, as every kind of species. And we are not stable. We will produce another metamorphosis, another species. So in this sense, it is not a problem at all, I would say, from a purely biological point of view.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your beautiful papers. I was actually wondering if Hannah could respond to the same question, but for different reasons. One thing that I found particularly interesting about your talk is towards the end, when you were speaking about Bjork, which was a pleasure in itself, about the empty spots and various parts of sensation, and how those empty silences and sound or in vision might enable one to pass into, and I'm badly paraphrasing you now, into a future we do not yet know how to live. And at the risk of sounding a little Lacanian, if we're trapped in this language which has gaps in it, that where we're forced to anthropomorphize or make or impose linguistic structures on our environment, how can is it possible for those silences and sounds and words to open up hopeful possibilities or alternatives for us? I hope I'm being clear.
Yeah, and I should say too that that language of the empty spot or the couloir, all of that's actually coming from Darius Sex's very strange, interesting 2009 play, Le Musée La Mer, which is much more the kind of dystopian seaside. So it's all sort of the end of the world at this aquarium, and all the aquarium endangered creatures are being sold and eaten. So there's just this one left at the end, called Bella. It's somewhere between it's called the Chose, maybe a ghost, and the last line of the play is ça se mange. Anyway, it's just that can be eaten. So it's just to say it's coming out of that language of kind of possibility is coming out of that play, and it struck me so much. This idea of an empty spot or a tunnel or a couloir, precisely because I think this is the way that that I'm thinking about what art. I mean, art or the literature classroom or close read. I mean, why close read at the end of the world, right? This is the question I'm asking myself at this point every day, right? What are we doing? But this notion that the classroom or the Boudin painting or the Bjork song could open up some kind of like a fissure. I mean, it's complicitous with the Capitalocene, right? It's part of it. It's like the beach is part of it, but it opens this kind of fissure or small space or couloir in which some kind of other meeting, some kind of other conversation or rencontre might take place. So I think. And I mean, this connects to both Donna Haraway and Anna Singh have engaged with this concept of the refugium, refugias, and as a concept of, as Donna Haraway describes it, as habitat patch, a habitat patch that makes survival and recovery possible. So like, for example, the refugium would be, during a drought, subterranean aquifers and springs that would sustain vulnerable life forms, right? So, so this is, I'm sort of trying to think about both the song or the work that we do as in my case, as a literature scholar, as that kind of sustaining or reparative work. Yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering if your wonderful phrase that there is no, which is a kind of a doing something weird to Lacan's, there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, there's no such thing as a natural relationship. I'm wondering if, in the interest of cross-pollination, there's a way of thinking about that project and that statement in relationship to this notion of a gap or an opening or a fissure or something like that. So, I mean, this is kind of just one vague, maybe too vague question. And then the other comment question, I think, goes back to this issue of power. And I think by defining world the way you do, it's hard to separate that from a political gesture right now, in the sense of the relationships between all living things, and then I would imagine that world would have something to do with the sustainability of the totality of all relationships. It seems like that's the end. That's what this is what I saw your talk aiming at. And again, I'm saying this against the thrill of being able to of your work, which takes us away from the human and takes us, I think, really away from the anthropomorphizing, despite the rhetorical element of the anthropomorphizing. I'm having trouble with that word too. So I don't know, just two comment questions. I don't know if.
I didn't understand my statement at the beginning of the first question.
So you said there's no such thing. Basically, you said there's no such thing as a natural relationship.
Yeah.
Which I was just, I was thinking about in relation as a kind of, I mean, and certainly plant sexuality upturns the entire world of psychoanalysis in every way, in wonderfully productive and destructive ways. And so I found that this relationality opens up a different way of thinking about those things.
Thank you so much. Perhaps we should think about, perhaps, it's a very interesting question in the sense that perhaps in the case of flowers, you don't have invisible unconscious. You have something which, the unconscious is something which is totally visible. And the problem is not to have they have a sort of psychoanalysis, but sensible psychoanalysis. Perhaps flowers are the sea of insects and on the contrary, something that we should think about. But the flowers are the unconscious of the other phantasm of insects, so something like that. And again, if you're saying that, perhaps we should learn also to transform psychoanalysis from this kind of analogy. I don't know how, but it's too easy to say that psi is a sort of an insect, which is pollinating ourselves, the psychoanalyst. But it's a very, very interesting question. I should think about that. And concerning the second question, of course, it's always difficult to answer to such this kind of political question. First of all, to me, because can I give perhaps two kind of answers, a very personal one and a more academic one. The very personal one is the fact that I'm speaking about plants and flowers and ecology, but I'm a professor actually in the real world. I'm a professor of history of Christian normativity, which is something very different from all of that. And to me, a lot of stuff that we call critical something, it's so linked with theological presuppositions that I have a lot of problem to assume this kind of public judgment about the world, moral judgment about the world. So this is a personal, it's not that I'm judging them, but I have a problem how to. And the other kind of answer, a more academic one, is the fact that first of all, it is interesting. It is even if we want to produce a sort of democratic relationship within this new politics, cosmic politics, we have to know all the forms of politics among species. We cannot transform ourselves into the policy of nature. We cannot transform the human being in the sort of police cops of nature who says what is right and was not right among species. What we can do is to modify our relationship to different species, but in a way, in order to do that, we even don't need this kind of stuff. I mean, it's so easy to say agriculture should be a little bit more sustainable, or we should not use plastic. We don't need actually this kind of stuff, to do this kind of or to take this kind of political measure. So, in this sense, I would really separate the two kind of discourse.
So I'm afraid we need to close off there. Before I say thank you, I just want to remind everyone, that in 15 minutes we will have Pamela Smith making a lecture right here. So just go far away. I think it's an exciting lecture. And now, please, thank you to our panel.